You're standing in the grocery store, a bag of garlic in your hand, a couple of bucks. Nobody's looking at you. Nobody cares. Nothing special happening here. But if you were holding that exact same thing, standing in that exact same spot, 4,000 years ago, what you're holding right now could buy you a human being. What you're holding was once a wage, a talisman. The reason thousands of workers threw down their tools, walked off the job in the middle of building the pyramids, and refused to move an inch until it was brought back to them. Garlic. Just garlic. Something you peel, toss in a pan, and forget about. But for 7,000 years, not a single civilization on this planet has ever rejected it. Not one empire didn't know it. Not one major war was fought without it. Hippocrates prescribed it. Roman soldiers carried it into battle. Medieval Europeans believed it could stop vampires. And in both world wars, when the medicine ran out, army doctors turned to it as a last resort. So what happened with this tiny little bulb, that the entire world ended up depending on it? And why does the story start in a place most people have never even heard of? Let's go back. 7,000 years. No cities, no roads, no grocery stores, just vast open steppes stretching between mountain ranges in Central Asia, in what is now Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. Nomadic people moving through narrow passes, surviving entirely on whatever they could find along the way. No food stockpiles, no doctors. When they got hurt, they dealt with it themselves. When they got sick, they pushed through. And one day, someone pulled something out of the ground that was growing wild. A small white bulb with papery skin, sharp and pungent when you broke it open. They tried eating it. And that moment might have been the first time in human history that anyone ever tasted garlic. But here's what's interesting. Garlic is not something you fall in love with at first bite. It burns. It smells. It tastes like nothing you'd call pleasant. So why did these nomads decide to keep it, carry it with them, and eventually start cultivating it? The answer isn't in the flavor. The answer is in what they noticed afterward. And that's something it took modern science 7,000 years to fully explain. Today, if you want to find garlic growing truly wild, with no human help at all, there's only one place on Earth you can find it. That exact region of Central Asia. Nowhere else. Garlic doesn't grow wild anywhere else on this planet. Everything you see in Spanish garlic fields, in Chinese garlic farms, in American supermarket bags, all of it was brought there and planted by people. That's proof that garlic followed humanity, not the other way around. We carried garlic across the world, one footstep at a time, for thousands of years. And the reason we did is simple. Garlic kept us alive. In harsh nomadic conditions, with no doctors and no medicine, anything that stopped a wound from getting infected, settled a sick stomach, helped your body fight off disease and cold, that thing was worth more than almost anything else. The ancient Indians, the first people to fully domesticate garlic, understood that early on. They didn't need to know why it worked. They just needed to see that the people who ate it stayed healthier than the people who didn't. And from those Central Asian steppes, garlic began a journey that would take it places no one could have predicted. Around 3000 BC, trading parties from India started moving west, carrying goods, and carrying garlic. They reached Mesopotamia, the land between two great rivers, which is modern-day Iraq. This is where the Sumerians were building one of the very first civilizations in human history. The Sumerians had writing pressed into clay tablets. They had libraries. They had a medical system. They had physicians. And when garlic reached them, the first thing they did was write it down. Clay tablets from ancient Sumer, over 4,000 years old, record garlic as a significant medicinal ingredient, not a peasant food, not something for the poor. This was documented by the most educated, most sophisticated people of that civilization. But what's even stranger is that garlic wasn't only for the living. Across the ancient Middle East and Asia, garlic was buried with the dead, not because people didn't know what to do with it, exactly because they did. So well, in fact, that they believed whatever had kept you healthy in this life would be just as necessary in the next. Garlic had stopped being food or medicine. It had become something sacred. From Mesopotamia, Garlic spread along the trade routes. No trucks, no ships with engines. Just human feet, camels, and small riverboats. And yet, within a few centuries, garlic had crossed thousands of miles, west into Egypt, east into China, into civilizations that had never met each other and never would. And the strangest thing, all of those civilizations, completely independently, reached the same conclusions about garlic, the same uses, the same beliefs, as if garlic proved its own value everywhere it landed, without anyone having to tell people what to think. But among all the civilizations that embraced garlic, one empire took it further than any other. They didn't just eat it, they paid wages with it. They treated it as sacred, and they used it to build the greatest structures human hands have ever made. In 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter stood before a sealed stone door in the Valley of the Kings, Egypt. Behind that door was the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, untouched for more than 3,200 years. When they broke through and stepped inside, they found gold, jewelry, bronze and ivory statues, a gilded chariot, thousands of treasures belonging to one of the wealthiest rulers in all of ancient history. And in the corner of the room, sitting in ordinary clay pots, they found garlic, several bulbs of garlic. Still intact after more than 3,000 years in the dark, some of the pots were even shaped like garlic bulbs, as if whoever made them wanted to express a particular reverence for what was inside. The Egyptians buried with their pharaoh the things they considered most essential for life in the next world: food, water, gold, and garlic. On that list, garlic sat alongside the most valuable things they owned. But that's not the most surprising part. The workers who built the pyramids at Giza, the men dragging stone blocks weighing anywhere from 2 to 80 tons through the desert heat, were partly paid in garlic. The Greek historian Herodotus, who traveled to Egypt and studied the history of the pyramids, recorded that the total amount spent on garlic and onions for the workers building the Great Pyramid of Cheops was the equivalent of 1,600 silver talents, an enormous sum. The Egyptians didn't do this out of tradition. They did it because they had observed, over enough time and across enough workers, that the men who ate garlic had more endurance, got sick less often, and worked more effectively. Garlic wasn't a benefit. Garlic was an investment. And now we get to the part that, the first time you hear it, you won't believe is real. One year, the Nile flooded far beyond its usual banks. The harvest failed. The garlic supply was cut off. When the deliveries stopped reaching the worksite, every single worker went on strike. They put down their tools, sat down, didn't move. The largest construction project in human history came to a complete stop. Officials panicked. The site went silent. All because of garlic. This was one of only 2 recorded labor strikes in all of ancient Egyptian history. And the cause wasn't violence, wasn't injustice, wasn't war. It was a garlic shortage, which tells you something. To those people, garlic wasn't a seasoning. It was a non-negotiable condition of showing up to work. But garlic's fingerprints in ancient Egypt don't stop at the worksite. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts on Earth, written around 1550 BC, records dozens of garlic-based treatments: headaches, snake bites, heart problems, intestinal parasites. The ancient Egyptians didn't know why garlic worked, but they had observed it across enough patients over enough centuries to know that it did. From Egypt, garlic crossed the Mediterranean and entered a civilization that didn't just eat it to survive. They ate it to win. The first Olympic Games in recorded history were held in Olympia, Greece, around 776 BC. No energy drinks, no protein bars, no performance gels or vitamin supplements. But the ancient Greek athletes did have one thing they ate before competing, something they genuinely believed gave them an edge: garlic. They ate it before the races, and the wrestling matches, and the javelin throws. Not as a ritual, because they truly believed garlic gave them physical strength and endurance. It sounds like the kind of quaint folk belief that history is full of, but more than 2,000 years later, controlled studies confirmed that garlic actually does improve circulation and reduce fatigue during physical exertion. The ancient Greek athletes had the right conclusion. They just didn't know why. But garlic in Greece wasn't limited to the sports arena. Hippocrates, still called the father of modern medicine, lived in Greece around 460 BC. He was the person who, more than anyone else, dragged medicine away from gods and superstition and placed it on the foundation of observation and logic. While his contemporaries were still performing religious ceremonies to cure the sick, Hippocrates was sitting at bedsides, taking notes, looking for cause and effect. And in his list of trusted treatments, garlic appears repeatedly. He used it for lung disease, for abdominal masses, for cleaning infected wounds, and helping the body clear out toxins. Hippocrates couldn't explain why garlic worked. The concept of bacteria wouldn't exist for another 2,000 years. But he could see, with his own eyes, that patients treated with garlic recovered better than those who weren't. For him, that was enough. After Hippocrates, garlic found a new path, the military. As the Roman Empire expanded across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, its armies carried garlic. Every unit on the march, whether headed to the freezing cold of Britain or the scorching deserts of North Africa, had garlic in their supplies. Not to make the food taste better, to stay healthy during long campaigns, in crowded camps where infection spread fast, in conditions where a small wound left untreated could kill you long before any enemy soldier had the chance. The chief physician of Emperor Nero's army officially documented that garlic helped clean the arteries and prevent disease from spreading through the ranks. He didn't have the vocabulary to describe exactly what was happening, but his conclusion, written nearly 2,000 years ago, turned out to be correct, confirmed by modern research we'd publish in a peer-reviewed journal today. Rome fell in the 5th century AD, but garlic didn't fall with it. It lived on in medieval Europe, filtering into monasteries, into peasant kitchens, into the medicine cabinets of folk healers, and in the centuries that followed, garlic took on the strangest role it had ever played in its long history. Picture a small village in Transylvania. Somewhere in the 1600s, someone in the village gets sick. Strange symptoms, skin going pale, strength draining away, getting weaker every day. A few weeks later, someone in the same family gets it too. Then a neighbor, then the whole street. Deaths, one after another, all following the same pattern. No microscopes, no concept of germs, no way to understand why illness seemed to walk from house to house like it had a will of its own. People could see the pattern clearly, but had no words for what was causing it. And into that explanatory vacuum, human imagination did what it always does. It filled in the gap. Something invisible was feeding on their village. A creature of darkness, coming in the night, taking what it wanted and disappearing. Vampire mythology wasn't born in a writer's imagination. It was born from real fear, in real communities, facing real deaths they couldn't explain. So how did garlic end up in that story? Not randomly. In villages where people used garlic consistently, hung it in their homes, ate it daily, they actually got sick less often. Not because garlic repelled anything supernatural, but because garlic genuinely kills a range of harmful bacteria in food, in the environment, in the air of a household. Houses with garlic were biologically cleaner. The people living there didn't know any of this, but they noticed the pattern. The households with garlic lost fewer people. They drew the conclusion available to them. Garlic has power over darkness. That belief spread across Eastern Europe for centuries. In Transylvania, Serbia, and Bulgaria, people incorporated garlic into protective rituals, hung it in windows and doorways, and placed it in the mouths of the recently dead before burial, to make certain the dead stayed dead. Then in 1897, Irish author Bram Stoker published Dracula. That book defined vampire mythology for the entire Western world, and it never lets go. In the story, Professor Van Helsing uses garlands of garlic to protect his patient from Count Dracula, spreads garlic juice on the walls of her room, fills every corner of her space with it. Stoker didn't invent this. He pulled it directly from Eastern European folklore that had been alive for hundreds of years. And from that book, the whole world learned. Garlic and vampires are natural enemies. There's a detail worth noting here. The word allium, the Latin name for the garlic family, is connected by some linguists to an ancient Celtic root meaning monster slayer. Whether that's accurate or not, The Celts were apparently calling garlic a monster killer long before Dracula existed. And in a sense, they weren't entirely wrong. Garlic doesn't repel vampires, but it does kill the invisible things that people in those centuries called monsters. Bacteria, parasites, the pathogens causing infections that spread through a village and looked, to terrified observers, like something supernatural was feeding on their community. The mythology and the reality, in this case, are closer together than you might think. But by the 19th century, folklore wasn't enough anymore. Science started looking at garlic seriously, and what it found changed garlic's role one final time, this time on the most literal battlefields of the modern world. Paris, 1853. Louis Pasteur is working in his laboratory, surrounded by bottles and microscopes. He's the man in the process of rewriting everything humanity understood about disease. Before Pasteur, people believed illness came from bad air, from imbalances in the body, from causes no one could see or name. Pasteur was the one who proved that disease comes from living microorganisms, what he called germs. One day he ran a simple experiment. He placed garlic into a culture containing bacteria. Then he watched. The bacteria died. This was the first time in history that modern science confirmed what the Egyptians had written in the Ebers Papyrus, what Hippocrates had observed at his patients' bedsides, what Roman soldiers had experienced in the field. Garlic kills pathogens. Not magic, not belief, just chemistry. A natural mechanism that humanity had been exploiting for 7,000 years without knowing its name. But the real significance of Pasteur's discovery only became fully clear 60 years later, in the trenches of World War I. In 1916, northern France and Belgium, millions of soldiers living in conditions that animals wouldn't tolerate. Mud, rats, the dead. Wounds left unattended too long. Medical supplies running out. The thing killing soldiers wasn't just bullets and shells. It was infection. A small wound ignored for a few days could turn into gangrene. Gangrene in those conditions meant death, or amputation. When the British Army ran out of antiseptics, they did something almost no one expected. They turned to garlic. They pressed the juice from garlic cloves, soaked it into bandages, and applied it directly to wounds. Not because there was no better option available in theory, because the evidence showed it worked. It slowed infection. It saved cases that nothing else could. 25 years later, history repeated itself. World War II. The Eastern Front between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was the most brutal theater of war in modern military history. Millions of soldiers. Conditions worse than anything in the First War. And this time, Soviet soldiers had a particular nickname for what they carried in their packs: Russian penicillin. Penicillin, the modern antibiotic, discovered in 1928, wasn't always available in sufficient quantities on remote fronts. When the modern medicine ran out, Soviet soldiers used garlic. On the most savage battlefields of the 20th century, the same thing that had kept pyramid workers going 4,000 years earlier was keeping armed men alive in the snow. And in 1944, while the war was still being fought, an American chemist named Chester J. Cavalito did something no human being had ever managed in the previous 7,000 years. He isolated the active compound in garlic and gave it a name: allicin. The thing that's released when you cut or crush a garlic clove. The thing that produces that sharp, unmistakable smell. And the exact same thing that had killed bacteria in Pasteur's lab, kept soldiers' wounds from rotting, and made garlic-using households less susceptible to the diseases spreading around them. 7,000 years after a Central Asian nomad pulled a wild bulb out of the ground and ate it, humanity finally had a name for the reason it worked. Today, this planet produces around 29 million metric tons of garlic every year. Sit with that number for a second. 29 million tons. That's more than the combined weight of every skyscraper in New York City. The global garlic market is worth over $34 billion. More than the entire GDP of many countries. The cheapest thing in your grocery store's produce section is generating an industry the size of a small nation's economy. And who controls that industry? China. But here's the part that gets strange. It's not really China. It's one city. One single city in China's Shandong province. A place called Jinxiang supplies the majority of the world's garlic. Not one country, not one region, one city. The entire planet's garlic supply running through a single point on the map. China overall produces over 72% of the world's total supply, meaning for every 3 garlic bulbs sold anywhere on Earth, more than 2 of them came from China. But Jinxiang is where most of it originates, which is why it carries the title of Garlic Capital of the World, and earns it without any argument. The Chinese don't just grow the most garlic, they eat the most garlic. The average person in China consumes over 14 kilograms of garlic per year, about 31 pounds. In some rural parts of Shandong, people eat raw garlic cloves the way people in other countries eat apples. Fresh, 1 clove at a time, as an everyday snack. That figure is roughly 10 times what the average American eats. But the most striking thing isn't any production statistic. The most striking thing is that no cuisine on Earth has rejected garlic. Italian food without garlic isn't Italian food. Korean kimchi without garlic is just pickled cabbage. Arabic cooking, Indian cooking, Chinese cooking, Thai cooking, Mexican cooking, French cooking, Greek cooking, all of them, every single one, using the same thing. No other ingredient on this planet, with the possible exception of salt and water, appears in the kitchens of more human cultures than garlic does. And science still hasn't finished the story. Garlic isn't a miracle cure, but 7,000 years of human observation doesn't happen by accident, and researchers are still publishing new findings every year, slowly catching up to what our ancestors figured out through nothing but watching and paying attention. You're standing in the grocery store, a bag of garlic in your hand, but now you know something that most people don't. What you're holding was in the hands of the men who built the pyramids, when they walked off the job and refused to come back until it was returned to them. It was placed in a pharaoh's tomb alongside gold and ivory and carved statues of gods. It was given to the first Olympic athletes in history before they walked into competition. It was prescribed by the man who built the entire foundation of modern medicine. It traveled with Roman soldiers across 3 continents. It hung in the windows of Eastern European homes when people needed protection from whatever was taking their neighbors in the dark. It soaked into the bandages pressed against wounds in the trenches of World War I. And it was called Russian penicillin by soldiers on the coldest, deadliest front of the 20th century. You're not just buying garlic. You're bringing home 7,000 years of human history. And here's what garlic is actually trying to tell us, if we're willing to listen. In those 7,000 years, so many things came and went. Empires rose and collapsed. Ideas that seemed immortal were forgotten within a generation. Things called essential turned out to be optional. But garlic was never forgotten. Not because it smelled the best, not because it looked the most impressive, not because anyone forced people to use it, but because it genuinely worked. And the things that genuinely work don't disappear. 7,000 years, from the steppes of Central Asia to a pharaoh's tomb, from the Olympic Games to the trenches of World War I, from vampire folklore to Pasteur's laboratory, from a Soviet soldier's pack to the shelf you're standing in front of right now. One small bulb witnessed all of it, and tomorrow, when you peel a clove and drop it in the pan, when that smell hits the air and fills your kitchen, know that you're doing exactly what humans have been doing for 7,000 years, not out of habit, because it's worth doing.